After 12 years of marriage, I thought I knew my wife. I thought we were unshakable. But the day she sat me down and said, "I'm going on a date. It's not about you, it's about me," my world came crashing down. I gave her everything, my loyalty, my trust, my family, and she threw it all away for a cheap thrill. What she didn't expect was that her choices would have consequences, and I made sure she paid the price. But before we dive into the twists and turns of this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Dave and Laura's marriage seemed unshakable, built on 12 years of shared experiences, trust, and mutual support. From the outside, they appeared to have everything: a cozy home, 2 bright kids, and a rhythm to their lives that spoke of stability. They were partners in every sense, relying on unspoken promises to guide them through challenges. Trust and loyalty had been their foundation, unchallenged and unbroken. But cracks began to form in ways Dave couldn't ignore. Laura, once attentive and warm, had grown distant. Small moments of connection, shared laughs over dinner, spontaneous hugs, had faded into routine. At first, Dave dismissed the shift as the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage. Yet, unease settled in his gut as Laura began spending more time away. After all, he kept the property associates list so his wife wouldn't have to give David his identity to prove he wasn't some low-life politician. But cracks appeared in the walls that were buried deep. The woman he thought he knew so well was slipping away, one unanswered question at a time. Dave first met Laura during their sophomore year of college. She wasn't just charming, she was magnetic. At every gathering, her laughter drew people in, her sharp wit disarming even the most cynical. Dave, a quiet and steady type, found himself mesmerized by her ease with the world. Their relationship unfolded quickly. Late-night coffee shop dates turned into weekends spent exploring the city. Laura's curiosity about life was infectious, and Dave often found himself doing things he never imagined, from impromptu road trips to salsa dancing lessons. Laura lit up his world, and he grounded hers. She loved his dependability, calling him her rock during the chaos of college life. Their love was intense, filled with promises of forever whispered under starlit skies. When they graduated, marriage felt like the natural next step. Dave believed they were unshakable, destined to face life's challenges together. Laura's recent behavior was subtle but jarring. She avoided Dave's gaze during conversations, her answers clipped and rehearsed. Her phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter, was now a constant companion, buzzing frequently, always tilted away when Dave tried to glance at it. Dave, struggling to reconcile her behavior with the woman he married, took action. One quiet evening, while Laura was in the shower, he stood at the counter, staring at her phone. His hand trembled slightly as he picked it up, his breath shallow. He wasn't proud of invading her privacy, but the knot in his stomach demanded answers. Scrolling quickly, his heart sank when he saw the name Eric appear repeatedly. The messages were brief but familiar in tone, hinting at plans and inside jokes. Dave's chest tightened as a mix of anger and heartbreak overwhelmed him. He set the phone down just as he heard the shower stop, his mind racing with what to do next. Dave first noticed the shift in Laura's demeanor during a quiet Saturday evening. She sat across from him on the couch, scrolling endlessly through her phone. The glow of the screen cast shadows across her face, and she was smiling. A soft, private smile that Dave hadn't seen in months. "Something funny?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Laura barely looked up. "Just a meme, you wouldn't get it," she said. The dismissiveness stung more than he cared to admit. Laura had always been the first to share a laugh, to include him in her little moments of joy. Now, her laughter felt like a secret, one he wasn't a part of. At first, Dave dismissed it. Maybe she was stressed from work, he thought. Everyone goes through phases, but as the weeks passed, the changes became harder to ignore. Laura started going out more. Work dinners or girls' nights she hadn't mentioned before. She'd leave the house dressed more carefully than usual, her perfume lingering in the air long after she was gone. One evening, as she was getting ready to leave, Dave leaned against the bedroom doorframe, watching her adjust her earrings. "You've been busy lately," he said, his tone light but probing. Wait. She glanced at him through the mirror, her expression unreadable. "Is that a problem?" "No, just unusual." She turned to face him, her arms crossed. "Dave, not everything needs to be a big deal." Her tone was sharp, defensive, and she walked past him without waiting for a response. Dave's unease grew, a constant whisper in the back of his mind that refused to be silenced. One night, when Laura's girls' night extended well past midnight, he sat in the living room, staring at the clock. The kids were asleep, and the house was eerily silent. He glanced at her phone, left carelessly on the kitchen counter, and hesitated. He wasn't the type to snoop, but something about her recent behavior felt wrong. Heart pounding, he unlocked the phone and scrolled through her messages. Most were mundane, but then he saw it. Texts from a number saved as Eric. The conversation wasn't overtly romantic, but it was intimate enough to set his heart racing. "Can't wait to see you," one message read. Another simply said, "Tonight was amazing." The sound of the garage door startled him. He quickly placed the phone back where he'd found it and sat down at the kitchen table, pretending to sip from a mug. Laura walked in, her cheeks flushed, and stopped when she saw him. "You're still up?" she asked, feigning nonchalance. "Couldn't sleep," Dave replied, studying her face. She avoided his gaze, heading straight for the sink to rinse out her glass. "Long night?" "Yeah," she said, keeping her back to him. "Just tired." But her tone and her body language screamed a different truth. Dave sat there, silent but resolute, knowing this wasn't something he could ignore any longer. The woman he once trusted implicitly was hiding something, and he was determined to uncover the truth. It was a quiet evening, and the faint sound of rain tapping against the windows filled the silence. Dave was clearing the dinner table, stacking plates, while Laura sat unusually still, her hands clasped tightly around her wine glass. She hadn't touched her food much, and Dave could feel the tension radiating from her. When he returned from the kitchen, she was staring into her glass, swirling the wine absent-mindedly. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm but distant. Dave froze, the plate in his hand hovering over the table. He knew those words never led to anything good. Placing the dish down, he sat across from her, his stomach knotting. "What's on your mind?" Laura took a deep breath and finally looked at him. Her gaze wasn't soft or apologetic. It was steely, almost defiant. "I've been feeling restless," she began, choosing her words carefully. "Our life. It's just so predictable. Every day feels the same." Dave blinked, taken aback. "Restless?" he repeated, the word foreign and heavy in his mouth. "What does that even mean?" Laura sighed, leaning back in her chair. "It's not about you, Dave. It's about me. I need something different, something exciting." The words hung in the air, suffocating. Dave felt his heart sink, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Okay," he said slowly. "What are you saying?" Her eyes flickered away, unable to hold his gaze. She swirled her glass again, the sound of liquid moving inside filling the silence. Then, with a casualness that made his chest tighten, she said, "I've decided I'm going to go on a date." Dave's chair scraped against the floor as he stood, his body trembling. "You're joking," he said. His voice strained, trying to suppress the disbelief coursing through him. "I'm not," she replied flatly, still not meeting his eyes. "It's just for the experience. Don't overreact." "Overreact?" His voice rose and he stepped closer to her. "You're my wife, Laura. We made vows, built a family together. How could you even think this is okay?" Laura finally looked up, her expression a mix of guilt and irritation. "Dave, you don't get it. This isn't about you. I've felt trapped for so long, and I need this for myself." "Trapped?" He stared at her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "What about me? What about the kids? You think you could just waltz out of our marriage whenever it suits you and come back like nothing happened? I'm your son, since no one else will have me." She shrugged, her indifference cutting deeper than any shout could have. "I'll make it up to you later. You'll see." Dave let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair as he paced the room. "You're unbelievable. You think our marriage, our family, is something you can hit pause on for a cheap thrill?" Laura stood, setting her wineglass down with deliberate care. "I don't expect you to understand, but I need this. You can either deal with it or not. That's up to you." "Laura," he said, his voice trembling with anger and heartbreak, "you're making the biggest mistake of your life." She smirked, a cold and distant look in her eyes, and walked out of the room without another word. Left standing in the silence, Dave felt a storm of emotions swirling inside him. Anger, betrayal, heartbreak. They were all there, crashing against one another. But beneath the pain was something new, resolve. If Laura thought he would sit idly by while she tore their family apart, she was wrong. He sat down, hands trembling, and began writing everything he could remember. Her words, her behavior, her dismissive tone. She wanted to rewrite their story, but Dave vowed to reclaim control of the next chapter. Dave sat in the dim light of the living room, his hands gripping the edge of the coffee table as Laura's words replayed in his mind. "I need this for myself." The phrase echoed like a taunt, each syllable slicing deeper into him. He looked down at his hands, trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. The woman he had built his life with, shared dreams with, was now a stranger sitting across from him, casually unraveling everything they had worked for. He stood abruptly, unable to sit still under the weight of his emotions. He paced the room, the air too thick to breathe. Anger burned in his chest, but beneath it was a raw, hollow ache, a wound that refused to close. He clenched his fists, desperate to control the storm raging inside him. The house was eerily silent, the only sound coming from the faint hum of the refrigerator. It used to feel like a sanctuary, a place of love and laughter. Now it felt suffocating, a constant reminder of Laura's betrayal. Dave's gaze fell on her phone, still lying on the kitchen counter where she had left it. His heart raced as he approached it, hesitation warring with his growing need for answers. He picked it up, his fingers hovering over the screen. Was this who I've become? Someone who needs to spy on his own wife? But then he remembered her cold, dismissive tone, her refusal to meet his eyes. The memory fueled his resolve. He unlocked the phone and began scrolling through her messages. Most were harmless, mundane exchanges with coworkers or friends. But then he saw it. Eric's name again. The messages weren't graphic, but they were enough. Vague plans, flirtatious jokes, and the kind of lighthearted banter he hadn't shared with Laura in years. Each word felt like a slap, confirming what he had been too afraid to admit. Dave set the phone down, his hands gripping the counter to steady himself. His mind raced, shifting from pain to anger, and finally to determination. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. He wouldn't let Laura's decisions destroy the life they had built. He spent the rest of the night gathering what he could: bank statements, calendar entries, anything that might give him clarity. Or ammunition. The sound of Laura's laugh echoed faintly in his memory, a cruel reminder of what had once been. By the time the sun began to rise, Dave had made up his mind. He wasn't going to sit back and watch his world crumble. If Laura wanted to play games, he would make sure she understood the consequences. This wasn't just about their marriage anymore. It was about reclaiming control of his life, for himself and for his kids. Dave sat at the dining table, the early morning light casting long shadows across the room. His laptop hummed softly as he opened the shared bank account he and Laura had maintained for years. His heart pounded as he scrolled through the transactions, his eyes scanning for anything out of the ordinary. It didn't take long to spot the discrepancies. Expensive dinners at restaurants he'd never heard of, purchases from boutique stores that Laura had never mentioned, a spa visit just last week, another thing she had carefully omitted from their conversations. Each line item felt like a crack forming in the foundation of their already crumbling marriage. Dave leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. He wanted to dismiss it, to rationalize the spending as harmless, but the pit in his stomach told him otherwise. The financial anomalies only deepened his resolve. That afternoon, while Laura was out running errands, he turned his attention to her phone. He had watched her guard it like a lifeline, always tilting the screen away from him, quickly locking it when he walked into the room. But today, she'd left it on the counter. His hands trembled as he picked it up, the weight of his suspicions pressing down on him. Unlocking it felt like crossing an unspoken line. But he reminded himself of Laura's own betrayal. He navigated to her messages, scrolling past the usual threads, until one name stopped him cold. Eric. The messages weren't explicit, but they were damning. Looking forward to seeing you again. Last night was exactly what I needed. Dave's breath caught in his throat. His fingers hovered over the screen as if the words themselves might burn him. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was proof. The words on the screen were, "The phone." Determined to uncover the truth, Dave opened his laptop again. He started piecing together Laura's movements, cross-referencing her spending with her excuses. As the puzzle began to take shape, one thing became clear. Laura wasn't just restless. She was living a double life. Dave sat back, his hands gripping the edges of the table. The pain of betrayal surged through him, but it was quickly overtaken by something sharper. Resolve. Laura thought she could keep him in the dark, but she had underestimated him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Dave sat on the back porch, his phone pressed to his ear. The late evening air was crisp, but his mind was clouded with frustration and betrayal. The phone buzzed as Ethan picked up on the other end. "Dave?" Ethan's voice was warm, steady, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside Dave. "What's going on? You sound off." For a moment, Dave hesitated, unsure of how to even begin. Then the words spilled out in a torrent. "It's Laura," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "She's been distant, secretive. I found messages. Someone named Eric, and the bank account. There's money missing, dinners, places I've never heard of. She's been lying to me, Ethan." There was silence on the other end, then a sharp intake of breath. "She what?" Ethan's tone shifted, protective and brimming with anger. "Dave, are you serious? And you haven't confronted her yet." "I have," Dave admitted, running a hand through his hair. "She doesn't care. She says she's restless, that she needs this, like our family is just some phase she can step out of whenever she wants." Ethan let out a low whistle. "Man, I can't believe this. You don't deserve this crap." "I don't know what to do, Ethan." Dave's voice softened, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "You need to stay calm," Ethan said firmly. "Don't let her see you unravel. If she's lying, she'll trip herself up eventually, but you need proof, solid proof." "Ever thought about hiring a PI?" Dave blinked. "A private investigator? Isn't that extreme?" "Good when someone's trying to destroy your life," Ethan said bluntly. "You said it yourself. She's sneaking around. You need answers, Dave. Answers she's not going to give you willingly. Mike, the guy I used for that business case a few years ago, he's solid, discreet. He'll find the truth no matter how deep she's buried it." Dave leaned against the porch railing, his grip tightening. "You really think it's come to that?" Ethan's voice softened. "I know you don't want to believe it, but yeah, if she's hiding something, you need to know. For you and the kids. Call Mike." "And Dave?" Her smile slackened, and she scowled. "How do you know that Dave?" "Yeah. Whatever you do, don't lose your cool. She's counting on you to fall apart. Prove her wrong." Dave nodded to himself, the determination in his brother's voice seeping into his own. "Thanks, Ethan. I'll call him." "Good." Ethan said. "And Dave? You've got this." As the call ended, Dave stared out into the darkened yard, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just a victim in this. He had a family to protect, and he wouldn't let Laura's deceit tear them apart. Dave sat in the corner of a dimly lit office, the faint smell of coffee and old leather lingering in the air. Across from him sat Mike, a private investigator with a no-nonsense demeanor. Mike's sharp eyes, framed by lines that hinted at years of experience, studied Dave carefully. "You're sure about this?" Mike asked, leaning back in his chair. Dave hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I don't have a choice. She's hiding something, and I need to know the truth. For me, for my kids." Mike scribbled a few notes on a pad. "All right, I'll need everything you can give me. Phone numbers, her typical routine, places she frequents. The more details, the better." Dave slid a folder across the desk. Inside were screenshots of the messages he'd found, a list of suspicious transactions, and Laura's weekly schedule. Mike skimmed through the documents, nodding as he went. "This'll do for a start," Mike said, tucking the folder into a larger case file. "Give me a few days. I'll get to the bottom of this." The next few days were agonizing. Dave went about his routine, trying to act normal around Laura and the kids, but the weight of uncertainty pressed down on him. Every time Laura left the house with a casual excuse, his stomach churned. Was she meeting Eric? What was she telling him about their family? Finally, Mike called. "We need to meet," he said simply. "I've got something you'll want to see." In Mike's office, the air felt heavier. Dave's heart raced as Mike handed him a folder. Inside were clear, undeniable photos. Laura and Eric walking arm in arm into a hotel, the two of them laughing together at a bar, her hand resting on his arm. A grainy image of them sitting closely in a car, their heads leaned together in an intimate conversation. Dave's stomach turned as he flipped through the images. "There's more," Mike said, pulling out a second folder. This one contained phone records and text message transcripts. The conversations were explicit, full of flirtation and plans for their next meeting. Dave closed the folder, his hands trembling. "There's no denying it now," he muttered, his voice low and raw. Mike leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Dave, you've got everything you need. The question is, what are you going to do with it?" Dave looked up, his jaw tightening. "I'm going to make sure she owns every piece of this mess she's created. It's time for her to face the consequences." Mike nodded. "Good. Let me know if you need anything else. But Dave, stay smart. Don't let anger cloud your next move." As Dave left the office, the weight of the evidence in his hands was matched only by the resolve in his heart. Laura had made her choices, and now it was his turn to act. Dave sat at the kitchen table late into the night, the house silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Spread before him were the contents of the folders Mike had handed him: photos, financial statements, and phone records. Each piece of evidence was like a dagger, cutting through the layers of denial he had tried to maintain. He picked up the financial statements first, his eyes scanning the list of transactions: lavish dinners, boutique clothing stores, and a hotel reservation. Dave clenched his jaw, the betrayal twisting in his chest. He thought back to Laura's excuses: work meetings, catching up with friends, lies. All of them. The photos were worse. He had stared at one earlier, trying to convince himself it wasn't as bad as it seemed, but it was undeniable. Laura, dressed in a way she never did for him anymore, laughing with Eric as they walked into a hotel. Another showed her leaning into him at a bar, her hand on his arm. Her expression was one Dave hadn't seen in years, unburdened, carefree. Dave's hands trembled as he placed the photos down, his heart pounding with anger and heartbreak. He couldn't ignore the texts any longer. Although he felt panicky and angry, he immediately responded to the texts by praying for their success. Mike had extracted snippets of Laura's conversations with Eric. Dave read them one by one, each word cutting deeper. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." You make me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. Dave closed the folder, his fists tightening. He had spent 12 years building a life with Laura, sacrificing, supporting her, trusting her. And this? This was how she repaid him? She smiled as she grabbed the folder and put it on her desk. "You're?" she asked. He turned to her. He heard her footsteps approaching from upstairs, the familiar creak of the staircase. Quickly, he gathered the evidence into a pile and slid it into a drawer. Laura appeared in the drawer, her hair slightly disheveled. "You're still up?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Yeah," Dave said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "Just going over some bills." She avoided his gaze, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "Don't stay up too late." She turned and walked away without another word. Dave exhaled, his resolve hardening. He had all the proof he needed now. The woman who once promised him loyalty had betrayed him in the worst way, and there was no undoing the damage. For a moment, he allowed the sadness to wash over him, but it was quickly replaced by determination. If Laura wanted to rewrite their life story, he would make sure the truth was written in ink that couldn't be erased. The next morning, he called his lawyer, Sarah. "I have everything," he said, his voice firm. "It's time to take the next step." Sarah's voice was calm but approving. "Good, send me what you have and we'll start preparing." Dave hung up and stared out the window. The storm was far from over, but now he wasn't just enduring it, he was ready to fight back. The tension in the house was palpable as Dave stood in the living room, the evidence folder clutched tightly in his hand. Laura entered, her expression casual, as if she hadn't just turned his world upside down. "We need to talk," Dave said, his voice low but firm. She glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "Now?" "I'm exhausted, Dave." "Now," he repeated, his tone brooking no argument. Reluctantly, she sat on the couch, folding her arms. "All right. What's so urgent?" Dave placed the folder on the coffee table between them, opening it to reveal the photos, financial statements, and text message transcripts. "Explain this," he said, his voice trembling slightly, a mix of anger and heartbreak. Laura leaned forward, her eyes scanning the contents. Her face betrayed a flicker of shock before she quickly composed herself. "Have you been spying on me?" she asked, her tone accusatory, avoiding the question entirely. "Don't turn this on me," Dave shot back, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "You've been lying to me, sneaking around, meeting Eric. I have the proof, Laura. Just tell me the truth." She leaned back, crossing her arms tightly. "You're paranoid," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Always looking for something that isn't there. This is why I feel trapped, Dave. You don't trust me." "Don't twist this," Dave said, his voice rising slightly. "I trusted you for 12 years, and you've been lying to my face. You think I don't see the late nights, the phone calls, the excuses?" Laura rolled her eyes, standing up abruptly. "You're suffocating, Dave. That's the real problem. You've always been controlling, always needing to know where I am and what I'm doing. It's exhausting." Dave stood too, his frustration boiling over. "Don't you dare call this control. This is about respect, about honesty, something you clearly don't understand anymore." She smirked, a cold and dismissive gesture that made his blood boil. "Think what you want. You're overreacting, as usual. Eric is just a friend, and this," she gestured at the folder, "is pathetic." "Pathetic?" Dave's voice cracked with emotion. "What's pathetic is throwing away your family for this, for him. Do you even care about what this is doing to us? To the kids?" Her face hardened. "I don't have to explain myself to you," she snapped. "If you're so unhappy, do something about it." Dave stared at her, the finality of her words hitting him like a punch to the gut. She wasn't going to admit anything, wasn't going to apologize. She had chosen her path, and it didn't include him. Without another word, he closed the folder and walked away. He didn't yell, didn't plead. The time for that was over. In the quiet of his office, Dave called Sarah. "It's done," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "She's not going to stop. We need to move forward," Sarah said. Sarah's voice was calm and reassuring. "Good. We'll make sure she faces the consequences." Hanging up, Dave sat in the silence, his resolve hardening. Laura thought she could dismiss him, manipulate the situation, but she had underestimated him. He wasn't going to crumble. He was going to fight. And this time, he would be ready. Dave sat in Sarah's office, the weight of the evidence he had gathered pressing heavily on his shoulders. The room was pristine, with sleek furniture and framed degrees lining the walls, but its sterile calm did little to ease the storm in his mind. Across from him, Sarah flipped through the folders he'd brought, her sharp eyes scanning each page with practiced precision. "You've done your homework," she said, setting the folder down and folding her hands on the desk. "Photos, financial inconsistencies, texts. This is solid, but it's just the start." Dave leaned forward, his voice laced with frustration. "She's been lying to me for months, Sarah, sneaking around, taking money out of our accounts, and now she acts like I'm the one at fault. I need to protect my kids." "And we will," Sarah replied firmly. "The first step is filing for temporary custody. The evidence you've provided shows that her behavior isn't just reckless. It's damaging to your family. Courts will take that seriously." Dave nodded, his hands clenching in his lap. "And what about the house? The kids can't lose their home on top of everything else?" "We'll file an injunction to prevent her from making any unilateral decisions about the property," Sarah said. "But Dave, this isn't just about legal strategy. Laura's already trying to control the narrative, isn't she?" Dave sighed, rubbing his temples. "She's been telling anyone who will listen that I'm paranoid, controlling. She even posted on Facebook, making herself out to be the victim." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll address that too. Document everything she says or does from here on out. The more erratic she becomes, the stronger your case will be." Just as they were wrapping up, Dave's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw an unexpected name. "Jenna." "Take it," Sarah said, sensing his hesitation. Dave stepped into the hallway and answered. "Jenna?" Her voice was hesitant but clear. "Dave, I don't know if I should be calling you, but I can't keep quiet anymore. Laura's been telling people lies about you, saying you're abusive, that you've been manipulating her for years. It's not true, and I know it's not true." Dave's grip on the phone tightened. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I found out what she's really been doing," Jenna said, her voice thick with disgust. "She's been bragging about how she's going to win, saying she'll paint you as the bad guy so she can come out of this clean. I have screenshots of her messages. I thought you should have them." Dave's heart pounded. "Send them to me." Minutes later, the screenshots arrived. They were damning. Texts where Laura mocked his attempts to reconcile, admitted to manipulating friends, and detailed her plans to discredit him in court. Back in Sarah's office, Dave handed her his phone. "You need to see this." Sarah's eyes narrowed as she read through the messages. "This changes everything," she said, a note of triumph in her voice. "Jenna's testimony combined with these screenshots adds a whole new layer to our case. Laura's not just being deceitful, she's actively trying to destroy your credibility. The court will not look kindly on this." For the first time in weeks, Dave felt a glimmer of hope. "So what's next?" Sarah smiled faintly, her confidence unshakable. "Now we make sure the truth comes out, in every painful detail. Laura wanted a fight? She's about to get one." As Dave left the office, the evidence in Sarah's capable hands, he felt the burden on his chest lighten ever so slightly. The path ahead would be brutal, but he wasn't fighting alone. And this time, he wouldn't let Laura control the story. This time, he was ready. Dave's phone buzzed incessantly, notifications piling up faster than he could swipe them away. Friends, acquaintances, even distant relatives were messaging him, their tones varying from concerned to outright accusatory. He finally opened Facebook, his stomach sinking as he read Laura's latest post. For years, I've endured manipulation and control. I stayed silent for the sake of my children, but I can't anymore. People need to know the truth. Abuse isn't always physical. It's the words, the cold stares, the isolation. I'm finally finding the courage to speak out. Below the post was a picture of Laura, her face tear-streaked and pained. The comments were a battlefield. Stay strong, Laura. You deserve better. This is so brave of you to share. But why post this publicly? Shouldn't this stay private? Dave sat in silence, his fists clenched as he read through the reactions. It was one thing for Laura to lie to his face, but to paint him as an abuser in front of the world? That was something else entirely. He stood abruptly, pacing the length of the living room. The kids were upstairs, oblivious to the storm raging online. He knew he couldn't afford to lose his composure, not in front of them. His mind raced, replaying every interaction with Laura. Had he ever done anything to warrant this? The answer came swiftly, no. Picking up his phone, he called Sarah. She's crossed a line, he said, his voice tight with anger. She's calling me abusive on Facebook. People are believing her. On the other end, Sarah's voice was calm, but sharp. This was predictable, Dave. It's classic deflection. She knows the truth is closing in, and she's trying to control the narrative. Forward me the post and any screenshots you can get of the comments. We'll use this. Dave paused, his fingers hovering over the share button. But what if this damages my reputation? My job? I am definitely asking for your opinion. It's already happening, Sarah said bluntly. But trust me, this post will backfire. Courts take false allegations very seriously. The more desperate she gets, the more she exposes herself. Later that evening, Dave sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through the post again. He noticed some unexpected comments from people defending him. I've known Dave for years. He's one of the most patient and kind people I've ever met. This doesn't add up. This feels performative, Laura. If you're truly in danger, why not go through the proper channels instead of posting here? The messages gave him a small sense of relief, but the damage was done. He closed the app and looked at the kids' framed pictures on the counter. This fight wasn't just about his reputation. It was about protecting them from the fallout of Laura's actions. The next morning, Dave met with Sarah, armed with screenshots and a determination he hadn't felt before. She wants to smear me? Fine, he said, his voice steady. But she won't get away with it. Not this time. Sarah nodded. Let her dig her own grave. We'll make sure the truth buries her. And with that, the next phase of the battle began. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation as the judge entered and everyone rose to their feet. Dave sat at his table, his lawyer Sarah beside him. Her calm and collected demeanor, a sharp contrast to the storm raging in his chest. Across the room, Laura sat with her attorney, a well-dressed man with an air of confidence that most otherwise might have felt noxious to the conversation. As proceedings began, Laura's lawyer wasted no time in painting her as the victim. Your Honor, he began, stepping confidently toward the bench. My client, Mrs. Taylor, has endured years of neglect and emotional hardship. Mr. Taylor's controlling behavior has left her isolated and desperate. Her actions, while perhaps unorthodox, were driven by a need to reclaim her sense of self and provide stability for her children. Dave clenched his fists under the table, his jaw tightening as the attorney's words echoed through the room. He wanted to shout, to refute every lie, but Sarah placed a calming hand on his arm, silently reminding him to stay composed. The lawyer continued, his tone growing more impassioned. Mrs. Taylor's recent social media posts reflect the courage it took to speak out. They demonstrate her willingness to put her children first by seeking a healthier environment. This case is not about infidelity. It's about a mother fighting for her children. Sarah stood as soon as he finished, her movements measured and precise. She approached the bench, her voice steady and firm. Your Honor, my client, Mr. Taylor, has been nothing but a devoted father and husband. The evidence will show that Mrs. Taylor's claims are not only baseless, but part of a calculated attempt to deflect from her own misconduct. She turned to the judge, holding up a thick folder. We have documented evidence of Mrs. Taylor's affair, financial irregularities, and, most troubling, a deliberate smear campaign designed to damage my client's reputation. This is not a case of a mother protecting her children. It is a case of a woman trying to avoid accountability. The judge nodded, motioning for Sarah to proceed. Sarah's voice sharpened as she began presenting the evidence. First, let's address the financial discrepancies. Over the past 6 months, Mrs. Taylor has made multiple unauthorized withdrawals from their joint account, totaling thousands of dollars. These funds were used for lavish dinners, boutique shopping sprees, and hotel stays, none of which benefited the family. Laura's lawyer objected. Relevance, Your Honor. Financial decisions don't determine parenting ability. The judge raised a hand. Overruled. Continue, Ms. Daniels. Thank you, Your Honor, Sarah replied, handing a document to the court clerk. This is a detailed statement of those transactions, corroborated by bank records. She moved to the next point. Second, the affair. We have photographic evidence of Mrs. Taylor meeting her partner Eric at a hotel and a bar, as well as text messages that go beyond casual conversation. These messages, Your Honor, show a clear pattern of deceit and emotional abandonment toward her family. The room stirred as Sarah presented the photos and transcripts. Dave glanced at Laura, who shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her confident facade beginning to crack. Laura's lawyer attempted to regain control. Your Honor, this is character assassination. My client's personal life does not diminish her ability to parent. Sarah didn't miss a beat. Your Honor, these actions directly impact her credibility and demonstrate a lack of prioritization for her children's well-being. If Mrs. Taylor is willing to lie to her husband and misuse family resources, how can she be trusted to act in her children's best interest? The judge looked at Laura's lawyer. Objection overruled. Proceed. Sarah's tone turned sharper as she held up printed screenshots of Laura's social media posts. Finally, we have Mrs. Taylor's deliberate attempts to damage my client's reputation through false accusations on public platforms. These posts accuse Mr. Taylor of abuse without any evidence. Such behavior not only harms my client, but creates a toxic environment for their children, who are inevitably exposed to this animosity. Laura's lawyer stood again, clearly flustered. Your Honor, my client's social media posts were an emotional reaction to a stressful situation. They do not reflect her character. Sarah raised an eyebrow. An emotional reaction is one thing, Your Honor. A calculated campaign to discredit an innocent man is another. We also have testimony from a former friend of Mrs. Taylor, who has provided text messages in which Mrs. Taylor admits to fabricating these claims. The judge leaned forward, addressing Laura's lawyer. Do you have a response to this? He hesitated, then shook his head. Not at this time, Your Honor. The courtroom was silent as the judge reviewed the evidence. Sarah turned to Dave, her expression calm but resolute. This is it. She can't deny any of this. When it was Dave's turn to speak, he kept his focus on the children. Your Honor, he began, his voice steady despite the emotion bubbling beneath the surface. This isn't just about me or Laura. It's about our kids. I've done everything I can to provide them with stability, to shield them from this chaos. They deserve a home where they feel safe, where they know the truth. That's all I'm asking for. The judge nodded, her expression unreadable. As the proceedings concluded, Dave felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. Laura's lawyer had done everything he could, but the evidence was irrefutable. The judge's final words echoed in his mind. I will take all evidence into consideration and deliver my ruling shortly. This court is adjourned. As the gavel struck, Dave exhaled, his resolve stronger than ever. He had fought for the truth, and now he was prepared to face whatever came next. The courtroom grew silent as Danielle, Eric's ex-wife, took the stand. She was composed but visibly tense, her hands gripping the edges of the witness stand as she prepared to speak. Her sharp, clear eyes scanned the room, briefly meeting Laura's defiant gaze before settling on the judge. Sarah rose from her seat, walking to the center of the courtroom. Mrs. Harper, thank you for coming today. Can you tell the court about your relationship with Eric Harper and how recent events have impacted your family? Danielle took a deep breath. Eric and I were married for 10 years. We have 2 children together. Our marriage began to unravel about 6 months ago when I discovered his affair with Laura Taylor. Her voice was steady, but there was a hint of bitterness that even her composure couldn't mask. And how did you discover the affair? Sarah asked. I saw text messages on his phone, Danielle replied, her tone sharp. Messages from Laura. They weren't vague. They were explicit. She talked about how much better he made her feel, how she couldn't wait to see him again. At first, I confronted Eric, but when he admitted everything, I knew it wasn't just a fling. They were planning a future together. The judge leaned forward slightly, her expression hardening. Sarah handed Danielle a folder. Are these the messages you're referring to? Danielle nodded as the screenshots were submitted as evidence. Yes, those are the messages. They detail their meetings, including times they were together when Laura was supposed to be home with her family. Can you describe how this affected you and your children? Sarah's voice was calm but deliberate. Danielle hesitated, her voice trembling slightly. It destroyed us. My kids were confused and hurt. Eric moved out, leaving me to pick up the pieces. Laura encouraged him to break apart our family without any regard for the damage it caused. It was like we didn't matter. Sarah stepped closer. Did Laura ever communicate directly with you? I said, yes, Danielle said, her voice hardening. She messaged me once, saying, I'm sorry things didn't work out for you, but Eric and I are happy now. She wasn't apologetic. She was gloating. The courtroom murmured. Dave's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the table. Sarah let the moment hang before continuing. During the last 2 years, we've had big incidents like this. Mrs. Harper, why did you agree to testify today? Danielle straightened, her gaze unwavering. Because Laura needs to be held accountable. She didn't just destroy my marriage. She lied to her own husband and dragged their children into her mess. Dave deserves to know the truth, and so do his kids. When Sarah finished questioning, Laura's lawyer stood, his tone dismissive. Mrs. Harper, isn't it true that you're bitter about the end of your marriage and might have a personal vendetta against my client? Danielle didn't flinch. I'm here to share the truth, not my feelings. The evidence speaks for itself. As Danielle stepped down, the impact of her testimony was undeniable. Her words had exposed the full extent of Laura's deceit and left the courtroom in stunned silence. For the first time, Dave felt like the tide was turning in his favor. But his reputation as a weight loss professional was still in limbo. Dave took a deep breath as he stood and approached the witness stand. His palms were slightly clammy, but his resolve was firm. The judge watched him closely, her pen poised, while Sarah gave him an encouraging nod. This wasn't about Laura anymore. It was about the future of his children. As he was sworn in, Dave glanced briefly at Laura, who avoided his gaze, her focus fixed on the table in front of her. Mr. Taylor, Sarah began, her tone steady but supportive. Could you explain to the court your primary concerns regarding the current situation? Dave adjusted the microphone, his voice measured but filled with conviction. My concern has always been my children. They've been caught in the middle of something they don't understand, and it's my responsibility to make sure they're safe and have a stable home. They need to feel loved and secure, and right now, that's not something Laura can provide. His voice tightened slightly as he continued. I'm not perfect, Your Honor, no parent is, but I've always put my kids first. I've been there for the late-night fevers, the school projects, and the scraped knees. They know they can count on me. Sarah nodded. How has Laura's recent behavior affected the children? Dave exhaled, the pain evident in his expression. They're confused. They've asked why Mommy isn't home as much, why she's angry. I try to shield them from it, but kids notice everything. They deserve consistency, not chaos. He paused, his voice breaking slightly as he continued. My son told me the other night, Dad, things feel better when you're here. That's all I care about. Making sure they're okay. They didn't ask for this, and it's my job to protect them." The judge's expression softened slightly, though she remained composed. Sarah pressed further. "If granted primary custody, how do you plan to ensure their well-being?" Dave's tone was resolute. "I'll keep doing what I've always done, providing a home where they feel safe and loved. I'll focus on their education, their happiness, and making sure they know they're not to blame for any of this." As he stepped down, Dave felt a weight lift. For the first time, he wasn't just reacting to Laura's actions, he was taking control, fighting for what truly mattered. The courtroom was silent, the tension so thick it seemed to press against Dave's chest as the judge shuffled her papers. Dave sat stiffly at his table, Sarah beside him, her posture calm but alert. Across the room, Laura leaned toward her lawyer, whispering anxiously, her earlier confidence now replaced with visible unease. Judge Reynolds finally looked up, her sharp eyes scanning the room before she began. "This has been a challenging case, with emotions running high on both sides. However, my role is to prioritize the best interests of the children above all else." Dave held his breath, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "The evidence presented has painted a troubling picture," the judge continued. "Mrs. Taylor, your actions, including financial mismanagement, attempts to discredit Mr. Taylor through public accusations, and your involvement in an extramarital affair, demonstrate a pattern of behavior that undermines the stability and well-being of your children." Dave felt his heart pounding, each word from the judge reinforcing his hope. "Mr. Taylor," the judge said, turning her attention to him, "while no parent is perfect, the court recognizes your consistent commitment to providing a stable and nurturing environment for your children. Your testimony and evidence have shown that you are capable of prioritizing their needs above your own." Dave's throat tightened. He nodded slightly, his lips pressed together as he fought to keep his emotions in check. "Is the decision of this court," Judge Reynolds said, her voice firm, "to grant Mr. Taylor primary custody of the children. Mrs. Taylor, you will have supervised visitation rights to be reviewed in 6 months, pending evidence of improved conduct. Additionally, due to the financial misconduct and unnecessary escalation of this case, you are ordered to cover a portion of the legal fees incurred by Mr. Taylor." The gavel struck and the room seemed to exhale collectively. Dave sat frozen for a moment, the judge's words echoing in his mind. Primary custody. Relief flooded him, followed by a surge of gratitude and pride. He had fought for his children, and now they would have the stability they deserved. Laura's voice broke the silence, sharp and filled with venom. "This isn't fair. He's turning them against me." Judge Reynolds raised her hand, silencing her. "Mrs. Taylor, this is not the time to argue. The decision has been made. I suggest you focus on using this time to rebuild your relationship with your children in a constructive way." As the courtroom emptied, Dave turned to Sarah, his voice low and steady. "Thank you for everything." Sarah gave him a small, approving smile. "You earned this, Dave. Now go take care of those kids." Walking out of the courthouse, the crisp air hit Dave's face, and for the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, he knew that, but for his kids, for their future, he was ready for whatever came next. The decision from the court didn't sit well with Laura. For days after the hearing, she bombarded Dave with angry texts and emails, filled with accusations and veiled threats. "You think this is over," one message read. "You'll regret taking everything from me." Dave sighed as he read the texts, forwarding each one to Sarah without reply. "Let her lash out," Sarah had advised. "The more she digs in, the more she proves the court's decision was right." Laura didn't stop there. One evening, she showed up unannounced at Dave's house during his custody time. The doorbell rang loudly, jarring him, as he helped his daughter with her homework. "Mommy's here," his youngest exclaimed, running toward the door. Dave stepped in quickly, gently steering the kids back into the living room. "I'll talk to her. You two stay here, okay?" His brother's eyes widened as they loaded the periscopes. He opened the door, blocking the frame as Laura stood on the porch, her arms crossed and her face flushed with frustration. "You don't get to keep them from me," she snapped, her voice low but heated. "You have supervised visitation, Laura," Dave replied, his tone calm but firm. "You're not supposed to be here unannounced." "They're my kids too," she hissed, stepping closer. "And they need stability," Dave shot back. "This isn't about you or me anymore. It's about them. You need to respect the court's decision." For a moment, Laura looked like she might argue, but then her shoulders slumped. Without another word, she turned and walked back to her car, slamming the door behind her. Dave watched as she drove away, the tension slowly leaving his body. Inside, the house was peaceful again. The kids were laughing over a puzzle, and for the first time in months, Dave felt a sense of calm. The days that followed were quiet. Laura's texts grew less frequent, her presence fading into the background. For Dave and the children, life began to feel normal again. The house, once filled with tension and uncertainty, became a sanctuary, a place of warmth, love, and stability. As he tucked his youngest into bed one evening, she whispered, "I like it when it's just us, Daddy. It feels happy." Dave smiled, his heart swelling. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." The mornings felt different now. The house, once heavy with tension, was filled with soft sunlight and the quiet hum of stability. Dave sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee as his youngest daughter colored a picture beside him. The soft scratching of her crayons was a comforting reminder of how far they'd come. "Daddy, do you like it?" she asked, holding up a vibrant drawing of their family. There were only 3 figures in the picture, Dave and his 2 kids, smiling under a bright sun. "I love it," he said, his voice warm. He leaned down to kiss her head, the scent of her shampoo filling the air. "You're a fantastic artist." His son bounded down the stairs, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Dad, can we go to the park after school? You promised to show me how to throw a curveball." Dave grinned, standing to pour more coffee. "A promise is a promise, but only if you finish your homework first." The kids laughed, and for a moment Dave allowed himself to absorb the scene. It was simple, almost mundane, but it was a peace he hadn't felt in years. Later that evening, as he tucked his son into bed, the boy looked up at him with wide eyes. "Dad, it feels better now, like we're not walking on eggshells anymore." Dave sat on the edge of the bed, his heart swelling. "Life does feel better now," he said, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "And it's only going to get better. We're a team, you and your sister and me. No matter what, I've got you." The boy nodded, a small smile spreading across his face. "I know, Dad. I love you." "I love you too, buddy." Once the kids were asleep, Dave sat in the living room, flipping through a scrapbook the kids had made for him at school. Pictures of school plays, soccer games, and quiet family moments filled the pages. For the first time in a long while, he felt not just relief, but pride in the life he was rebuilding. There were still challenges ahead, but Dave had found his footing. He realized that his strength didn't come from trying to control the chaos around him, but from focusing on what mattered most, his children's happiness and well-being. The road to this point had been painful and full of hard lessons, but Dave knew now that he wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. Together, he and his kids were building something new, something beautiful, and it was a future worth fighting for. Betrayal, as painful as it was, became the catalyst for Dave's transformation. What once felt like the unraveling of his life turned into an opportunity to rebuild, stronger and more focused than before. The wounds Laura's actions left behind would never fully fade, but they had taught him the value of resilience and the necessity of standing firm in the face of adversity. Dave had learned that protecting his children wasn't just about shielding them from the chaos, but also about being an example of strength and integrity. His journey wasn't simply about winning a custody battle. It was about reclaiming his life and showing his kids what love and dedication truly meant. On a quiet Sunday morning, Dave stood in the backyard, watching his children chase each other across the grass. their laughter ringing out like music. The sun was warm, the air filled with the scent of freshly cut grass. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. He reflected on how far they had come. Every sleepless night, every difficult conversation, and every moment of doubt had led to this, a new chapter filled with peace and possibility. Joshua and Jeremy began meeting throughout the day, each one having 5s or 25s open on their phone. Looking at his children, he felt a profound sense of hope. The past was behind them, and the future was theirs to shape. "We're gonna be okay," Dave murmured to himself, a small smile on his lips. And for the first time, he truly believed it.